Hey, welcome back. Now, we've just added a variable to our enemy class, and that variable is of type uBehaviorTree. So we now have a behavior tree variable. And before we create a behavior tree, we need to make sure the enemy has an AI controller. So in this video, we're going to create a new class based on AI controller. So let's right click in our C++ classes/shooter folder and click new C++ class. And let's click show all classes and type AI controller. And select AI controller for the class and click next. Now we're going to call this enemy controller. Go ahead and click create class to generate this AI controller class. All right, so we have our enemy controller and we are ready to start adding some things to this class. Now, first and foremost, we're going to want a constructor, and we're going to put our constructor in a public section. And so let's go ahead and create that. And it's basically going to be a enemy controller, as all constructors are the name of the class. And aside from that, we also want to override a particular function. Now, controllers possess the pawn that they are controlling. And when they do so, there's a function that gets called, and it's called onPossess. We're going to override onPossess. So we're going to say virtual void, and the function is onPossess, and it takes an A pawn. We're going to call this inPawn, and this is an override, so we'll mark it with the override keyword. And we can go ahead and create some function bodies for these. So why don't we go ahead and do that in enemycontroller.cpp. So we need to fully qualify the constructor name. So enemy controller. And we're going to have onPossess also needs to be fully qualified. And there's a function body. Now, onPossess is an override of a parent function, and we're going to call the super version of this, so super onPossess, and we're going to pass that inPawn straight into that. So now we know that onPossess is being called properly. It's getting the parent version called. So we've now created an enemy controller. Now, our enemy controller is going to want to have a couple of variables. We're going to create a behavior tree and a blackboard for our enemy, and the enemy controller is going to want to access those. So we're going to create a couple of variables for a blackboard component and a behavior tree component. Now, we still haven't created the behavior tree or the blackboard. We're going to do that in the editor, but while we're setting this up, we're going to add those variables to the controller class. So we're going to forward declare these. First, we're going to add a uBlackboard component. So uBlackboard component, that's going to be a pointer, and we're going to call this Blackboard component. And we're going to give this a uProperty. Now, I'm going to make this blueprint read write. And the category can be AI behavior. And for the comment, we're just going to simply say Blackboard component for this enemy. Now we have a Blackboard component variable. We're also going to forward declare a variable for the behavior tree. And this will be of type uBehaviorTree component. That's also a pointer, and we're going to call it behavior tree component. And again, we're going to give this uProperty blueprint read write, and we'll stick it in the category AI behavior, and we can give this a comment that says behavior tree component for this enemy. Now, these variables should be private, so let's go ahead and make a private section for these. And just like we did with the enemy, we're going to want a public getter for the Blackboard component. So let's make a public section just beneath this, And we'll go ahead and create a public getter for the Blackboard component. So this will be force inline, and it's going to return a uBlackboard component pointer. We'll call this getBlackboard component. And it'll be const, and it'll return Blackboard component. So I'll scoot this over just so you can see the whole thing there. So we have a public getter for Blackboard component. Okay, so we're starting to get this controller capable of being integrated with an AI system we're creating here. Now, we have a Blackboard component and we have a behavior tree component. These are just empty pointers thus far. So in the constructor, we're going to need to construct these, and we use create default subobject just like we do with other components. So here in the constructor, we're going to construct these first starting with the Blackboard component. So we're going to say Blackboard component equals, and we're going to use create default subobject. Now this is going to be of type uBlackboard component. And we'll pass in the text macro, and we're going to say Blackboard component. And because we're using this uBlackboard component class, we're going to pull up our Unreal Engine documentation for this class and use the include. It's behavior tree / Blackboard component.h. Let's go ahead and include that here. Now, just after we've created this, we can use an assert to check and make sure this Blackboard component is valid. Otherwise, we can halt execution. And we can do that using a simple check assert. So we're going to say check Blackboard component. Now, just like we did with the Blackboard component, we need to create the behavior tree component. So we're going to say behavior tree component equals, and we're going to use create default subobject. And this will be of type uBehavior tree component. And we can give this one a text string and just simply say behavior tree component. And we'll also need to add the include for behavior tree component. So here's the Unreal Engine documentation for that, and here's the include. It's behavior tree / behavior tree component. So we'll add this to the top as well, and then we'll simply use an assert to check to make sure this is going to be a valid behavior tree component. So once we've created the Blackboard component and the behavior tree component, it's now time to assign this controller the Blackboard. Now notice that with our components here, we did not make them edit anywhere because we're not going to set these on the blueprint for this controller. We did that for the enemy class. Remember, on enemy.h, we added a variable for the behavior tree, and we made this edit anywhere. So the behavior tree is going to be set on our enemy. We need to take our behavior tree component here on the AI controller and initialize it using the enemy's behavior tree. We're going to do this in onPossess. Now in onPossess, we're going to take the pawn. This is the pawn that we're possessing. We're first going to check to make sure it's not null. So what we can do is we can first check to see if it is null. So if inPawn is equal to null pointer, we can simply return. Now after the check, we know that the pawn is not null. We can cast this to an enemy. So we're going to say a enemy, and I'm simply going to call this local variable enemy. We're going to use a cast to a enemy, and we're going to cast inPawn. Now, of course, we need to include enemy.h, so let's go ahead and do that right away. So we're going to say include enemy.h, and now we have our pawn cast to enemy. We're going to check to make sure that that cast was successful, so we're going to say if enemy, and then we're going to check to see if that behavior tree is set. So we're going to say if enemy And remember, we can get the behavior tree because we created a public getter on the enemy class called getBehaviorTree. So let's call that. We're going to check to see if that's valid. So getBehaviorTree. And if that is not null, now we're going to take our Blackboard component and initialize it by using the enemy's behavior tree. Now the Blackboard component has a function called initializeBlackboard. InitializeBlackboard takes an input parameter of type uBlackboardData. Now, we're going to configure the Blackboard and the behavior tree in the Unreal Engine editor very soon. So the behavior tree will be using the correct Blackboard asset. And once we do that, the behavior tree is going to use a particular Blackboard asset. Now, we can get that from the enemy. We can say enemy get behavior tree. So we're going to call that getBehaviorTree public getter. And from the behavior tree, we're going to access the behavior tree's Blackboard. And that Blackboard exists as a variable on the behavior tree called Blackboard asset. Now this function initializeBlackboard needs an input in the form of uBlackboardData. But Blackboard asset from the behavior tree is a pointer. So we need to dereference this pointer, this Blackboard asset. So we're going to actually use the dereference operator and wrap this whole thing in parentheses. Now we're getting a pointer to incomplete class type not allowed error, and getBehaviorTree returns a uBehaviorTree. So let's go ahead and include the header for uBehaviorTree, which is behaviortree/behaviortree.h. So once we put that up here at the top, I'll put it just above enemy, then we should get rid of that error. Okay, so before we compile this, I'm noticing that in the error section, member function declared with override does not override a base class member. And that caused me to look at the onPossess function name and realize that I have 3 S's here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete one of the S's here and go back to enemy controller.h and delete one of the S's there. And that should get rid of that error. So we're almost ready to compile this. One of the last things we need to do is make sure that our private variables have the correct meta specifier. We're making these blueprint read write, so we need to add the following to their U properties. Let's add meta equals, in parentheses, allow private access equals, and in quotes, true. We'll add this to both of these. And now let's go ahead and try to compile. And while that's compiling, I'll go ahead and summarize. We've created an AI controller. We gave the controller a constructor and an override for onPossess. We also created private variables for a Blackboard component and a behavior tree component, and we created a public getter for the Blackboard component. In our CPP file, we created our Blackboard component and behavior tree component with createDefault subobject, including the headers for both of those, and we also implemented onPossess by first calling super onPossess, then checking to see if inPawn was null. If not, we cast it to an A enemy, and if the enemy was valid, we called getBehaviorTree. Remember, we created a public getter for our behavior tree on the enemy class here. We call that, check to see if it's valid, and if it is, we initialize our Blackboard component here on the AI controller class, calling initializeBlackboard. InitializeBlackboard requires a uBlackboardData input parameter, and for that, we called enemies getBehaviorTree, and from the behavior tree, we get the Blackboard asset variable, which is of type uBlackboardData pointer. Since it's a pointer, we had to dereference that pointer, so we wrapped this expression in parentheses and used the dereference operator. Then we used that and passed it in to initializeBlackboard. So now our AI controller has a Blackboard component that should be initialized using the data from the Blackboard asset on our enemy's behavior tree. In the next video, we'll go ahead and set this all up in Unreal Engine by creating a Blackboard and a behavior tree, as well as a blueprint based on this enemy controller class. I'll see you in the next video.